Chapter 6. One might go so far as to say that it is strong, dominating personalities who might play a decisive role when things are changing. Somehow they always manage to speak with the voice of authority, and their innate strength of character drives them to take the lead in almost any situation. Allied to all this is their boundless optimism and faith in their fellow men. One such personality in the village of Holamamamidi was Dinarego, and it was his support of and belief in Gilbert that swayed the villagers over to a support of the cattle cooperative. Another such personality was Paulina Sebeso, who was to bring the women of the village to the farm and help open up the way for the new agricultural developments in Holamamamidi. Paulina Sebeso was quite a newcomer to the village, having lived there for not more than a year and a half by the time Micaiah arrived. She came from the northern part of Botswana, which fact immediately ensured her the friendship of Dinarego and Ma Milipede. Northerners really prided themselves on being inexplicable to the rest of the country. They speak Tswana at a faster, almost unintelligible pace, and have added so much variety to the Tswana language as to seem to an outsider to be speaking a completely foreign tongue. Thus, when Northerners greet each other, they say, "Good day, branch of my tree," while everyone else simply says, "Good day, my friend." The implication in the greeting, "branch of my tree," was a rather true one for the Northerners. At one time, they had been the most closely knit of all tribal groupings, each one claiming at least a distant relationship to even the most insignificant member of the clan. But once the family structure began breaking down under the migratory labor system, it was they who most readily practiced intermarriage with foreigners. Unfortunately for Paulina Sebeso, she married, at the age of 18, a foreign man from Rhodesia, whose tribal tradition it was to commit suicide when his honor was at stake. It wasn't a remarkable marriage, and her husband wasn't a remarkable man, being rather of a mild, passive, stay-at-home temperament. He worked as a bookkeeper for a certain large company, for which he received a wage of £30 a month. By careful saving, he managed to build a 2-room brick house for his family, and also every year added a heifer or two to their stock of cattle. He had worked for the company for 16 years when a new manager was appointed. Before long, the new manager claimed that £2,000 had been embezzled. He also produced evidence that a number of receipt books were missing. The only people who handled both money and the books were Paulina's husband and the manager. There was a doubt. On the one hand, the company believed the claim of Paulina's husband that he was innocent of the crime. He had worked for them for a long time, was known to be of sober habits, and the sum stolen was too large an amount to have been stolen by an African man. Petty pilferings had occurred here and there, but never vast sums. On the other hand, the receipt books had been removed in such a skillful manner as to suggest that the embezzlement had taken place over a number of years. In the end, the company charged both Paulina's husband and the new manager with the theft. On the day he was notified of this, Paulina's husband awoke in the night and hung himself from a tree in the yard. He left a note, once again claiming innocence. The company, being anxious to regain its money, dropped the court case and immediately seized the property of the dead man, claiming that the suicide was in fact an admission of guilt. Thus, being dispossessed of home almost overnight, Paulina moved with a son aged 10 and a daughter aged 8 to the village of Holamamamidi. The son, named Isaac, lived at a cattle post 25 miles away, herding his mother's cattle, while Paulina and the small girl remained in the village to grow crops. The 8-year-old girl, named Lorado, was thus able for most of the year to attend the village primary school, while the boy, Isaac, was tied to the cattle post and received no education at all. Perhaps Paulina was not a very beautiful woman. She was tall, thin, and angular, with a thin, angular face. She was also flat-chested, and like all flat-chested women, this was a sore point with her. It was hard to find suitable stuffed-up breast bodice in a country like Botswana, especially if you live in the bush. so she was in the habit of stuffing hers with carefully crumbled bits of paper. But she had lovely big black eyes that stared at everything in a bold way, and her long, straight black legs were the most beautiful legs in the village. She had a decisive way of walking, as though she always knew where she was going and what she wanted. She was fond of gaudy-hued skirts with strong colors like orange and yellow and red, and the bigger and brighter the splashes of color, the more she liked them. Since she was not by temperament given to brooding on the past, she soon recovered from the tragedy in her life and set out to build up a new life in Holama Momidi. Part of her plans also included a man, as she was a passionate and impetuous woman with a warm heart. It never really mattered what kind of man he was, or the magnitude of his faults and failings. It was just enough that her feelings be aroused and everything would be swallowed up in the blinding sun of devotion and loyalty. Of course, if she were to find a man who accidentally managed to gain the respect of the whole world at the same time, then this loved one could magically become 10,000 blazing suns. She had her land and home not far from the farm gates. There, directly in the path of the setting sun, Micaiah was in the habit of coming to watch the sunset. Just as at dawn the sun crept along the ground in gold shafts, so at sundown it retreated quietly, as though it were folding into itself the long, brilliant fingers of light. As he watched it all in fascination, the pitch-black shadows of night seemed to sweep across the land like an engulfing wave. One minute the sun was there, and the next minute it had dropped down behind the flat horizon, plunging everything into darkness. On intensely cold nights it threw up a translucent yellow afterglow, full of sparkling crystals, but otherwise it puffed itself out into a thin strip of red light on the horizon. As his eyes became more and more accustomed to the particular beauty of Botswana sunsets, he also noticed the dull green thorn bush and the dull brown earth were transformed into autumn shades of warm brown, red, and yellow hues by the setting sun. One evening, Micaiah walked right into a great drama. The thorn bush was seeding, and it did this in a vigorous way. One spray of seed struck him on the cheek, and on a closer inspection, he noticed that all the branches were profusely covered with bean-like pods. These pods twined tightly inward until they were coiled springs. Once the pod burst, the spring ejected the seeds high into the air. He stretched out his hand, broke off a pod, and pressed it open. A few minute kidney bean-shaped seeds slithered onto his palm. He stared at them in amazement. Could this rough, tough little thornbush be a relative of the garden bean? He decided to take the seeds back to the farm and question Gilbert. Paulina, meanwhile, had watched these comings and goings at sundown with avid curiosity, and at last, being unable to contain it, had sent the little girl to Micaiah with a message. This particular evening, Micaiah stood just a stone's throw away from her yard, and being absorbed as he was in the popping, spraying drama around him, he did not notice at first the child standing near him. And even when he did, he looked down rather absent-mindedly into a pair of small, beady black eyes. "Sir," the child said, "my mother says she sends you her greetings." "Who is your mother?" he asked. The child pointed in the direction of the huts. Micaiah glanced up briefly, was struck in the eye by a vivid sunset skirt of bright orange and yellow flowers, and momentarily captivated by a pair of large, bold black eyes. He looked down at the child and sent back a cruel message. "Go and tell your mother I don't know her," he said. He turned and, without looking either left or right, walked back to the farm. Paulina, on receiving his message, flamed with confusion and humiliation. So distressed was she that she rushed over to her friend, Ma Milipede. "Mamma," she said, "I've made a terrible blunder." And half hiding her face in her hands, she explained her blunder. "You've done nothing wrong, my child," Ma Milipede said, calmly. "It's just that Micaiah is a foreign man and not accustomed to our ways. The women of his country might have an entirely different approach when they wish to arouse the interest of a man." Paulina sat in thoughtful silence for a while. As far as she was concerned, there was only one woman equal to her in the whole village. Perhaps he is attracted to Maria, she said, and it nearly killed her to utter these words. Ma Milipede hesitated. The old man, Dinarego, had remarked that very day that Maria no longer attended her English lessons. These used to take place at just about sunset and last for an hour each evening. But now, for the last 3 days, Maria had sat at home by the fire instead of going to the farm as she usually did. Ma Milipede was hesitant to impart this information to Paulina, as already she looked the picture of despair. Look here, my child, she said firmly. The man is a newcomer, and you can't go jumping to conclusions. Besides, I suspect that Maria has long been in love with Gilbert, only you are not to spread that around. These words prevented Paulina from giving way completely to despair. She even gossiped quite gaily with Ma Milipede about trifling matters. Then, a short while later, arose and left for her own home. But Paulina's revelation of her interest in Micaiah caused Ma Milipede a few hours of anxious thought. Ma Milipede was of the old school, among whom, to a certain extent, foreigners were still taboo. Also, her experience of men had been a very limited and disastrous one. Most of all, she feared that another tragedy would be too much for her impetuous young friend. I hope Micaiah is a good man, she said over and over to herself. Just at this time, Micaiah was trying to avoid a situation at the farm that both exacerbated and amused him. To Gilbert, agriculture was a vast, rambling, intricate subject. The slope of the land and even the stones that lay on the land would spark off 1,000 speculations in his mind, and there were so few good listeners in the world that Micaiah found himself trapped and almost forced to listen to the long discussions on the marvels and wonders of the earth. Not that Micaiah minded. It was a welcome change to be hearing about these things. There was much more than South Africa that he was running away from, and it included everything that he felt was keeping the continent of Africa at a standstill. On the one hand, you felt yourself the persecuted man, and on the other, you so easily fell prey to all the hate-making political ideologies which seemed to him to be the order of the day. Yet these hate-making ideologies in turn gave rise to a whole new set of retrogressive ideas and retrogressive pride, and it was almost a mania to think that the whole world was against you. And how many pompous, bombastic fools had not jumped on this bandwagon? Yet the very real misery was still there. No matter what kind of fool you made of yourself, people in southern Africa were still oppressed. At some stage, and in an effort to solve his own dilemma, he decided to strike out on his own. He saw this mass of suffering mankind of which he was a part, but he also saw himself as a separate particle too. As time went on, he began to stress his own separateness, taking this as a guide that would lead him to the clarity of thought in all the confusion. It was rare. It was an uphill task in a part of the world where everyone tended to cling to his or her precious prejudice and tradition, and the act of letting go of it all greatly increased a man's foes. You find yourself throwing blows but weeping at the same time because of all the people who sit and wail in the darkness, and because of all the fat, smug persecutors to whom this wailing is like a sweet music, and some inner voice keeps on telling you that your way is right for you, that the process of rising up from the darkness is an intensely personal and private one, and that if you can find a society that leaves the individual to develop freely, you ought to choose that society as your home. Micaiah had made the first move along this road. At the same time, he was often stricken with guilt. If Joaz Tesepe had called him to his face a traitor to the African cause, he would have agreed in his heart because he threw most of his blows at Africa and had done so for a long time. Thus, when Micaiah met Gilbert, he was almost a drowning man, and this world of facts and scientific speculations seemed so much easier to handle. Therefore, Micaiah turned to agriculture for his salvation, and also to Gilbert. He did this in guilt and fear of his intuitions, because they seemed to him to lack any practical solution as to why so many people would be persecuted by so few, and why so many starved while a few had more than they could eat. Gilbert was a complete contrast to this wavering, ambiguous world in which Micaiah lived. He was first and foremost a practical, down-to-earth kind of man, intent only on being of useful service to his fellow men. There was nothing fanciful in him, yet the workings of his mind often confused and fascinated Micaiah. It was like one gigantic storage house of facts and figures and plans and intuitive judgments and impressions. The wheels kept on turning at such a fast pace that Micaiah never ceased to be amazed at the way Gilbert always spoke in a calm, almost soft tone, while the loud humming of these wheels was almost audible. Gilbert's mind was also like a stopwatch. He could abruptly break off a conversation and, 10 hours later, pick it up at the exact same point where he had left off. Gilbert prided himself on being an unusually well-informed man. No doubt the son did too. No doubt the son knew why the clouds formed, and why the wind blew, and why the lizard basked in its warmth, and all this immense knowledge made the sun gay and bright, full of trust and affection for mankind. But there were shut-away worlds where the sunlight never penetrated, haunted worlds, full of mistrust and hate, and it was about this side of life that Micaiah was particularly well informed. This sharp contrast in outlook called for a compromise, and Micaiah debated a while and then gave way. Although manly and independent-minded enough, he found it necessary to say yes, or merely listen on far too many occasions, and he consoled himself with the thought that he had a lot to learn. In any case, Gilbert's company and friendship disturbed him far less than most people's did, although Gilbert's views on African and world politics were extremely naive and childlike. Since poverty was so much a part of his work, Gilbert was fond of expounding on what the British socialists and the trade union movement had done to alleviate the atrocious living and working conditions of the poor. He several times mentioned his uneasy suspicions of the new Botswanan government, with its debates on democracy and a tax system that too eagerly encouraged private enterprise. "Where is all this talk of democracy going to get us, Mac?" he said one day glumly. "Only a reasonably developed country can afford the time to debate these pros and cons. What we need here is a dictatorship that will feed, clothe, and educate a people. I could work well with a dictatorship which says, 'Look here, Gilbert, fill in this poverty program.'" He looked at Micaiah, half smiling, half in deep earnest. Micaiah turned an almost hostile look. Not any politics in the world meant anything to him as a stateless man, and every political discussion was a mockery, he felt, of his own helplessness. Since he kept so quiet, it forced Gilbert to add apologetically, "I'm not saying that the dictator should stay here forever, Mac. He must eventually give way to the democracy. But in my opinion, a dictatorship is the best method for governing a country like this. What do you think?" Micaiah nearly laughed out loud. Gilbert's statements were an explanation of his own personality. He was a man only impressed by results, and he had been unable to produce these in Botswana the way agricultural experts had produced them in Russia and China. Micaiah wanted to put forward the idea that certain types of socialism might not be suited to African development. Africa had a small population, and it might well be that socialism of every kind was an expedient to solve unwieldy population problems. But his mind swerved away from even this. If a man talked about governments and political systems, he'd soon want to be a part of the whole rotten crew. He preferred to live in the bush. "Why not leave this country, even Africa, to trial and error?" he said slowly, uncomfortably. "This is only my opinion. I don't think I approve of dictatorships in any form, whether for the good of mankind or not. Even if it is painstakingly slow, I prefer a democracy for Africa, come what may." Whether this was a satisfactory remark or not, Gilbert never referred to politics again. Micaiah did not care because, more than anything, he hated politics. Perhaps people could be fed after all, and once it came to the time when a man had to die, he might be more proud to count up the number of his fellow men he had helped to live, rather than the number he had bombed into oblivion. It was this private anxiety to put his life to a useful purpose that made Micaiah an amenable listener to the long agricultural discussions, and since Gilbert had at last found a potential convert to his faith, he often pressed Micaiah into having supper with him. The food was quite often cooked by Maria, who had always been Gilbert's companion at this hour because of the Tsuwana and English lessons. On the 2 occasions Micaiah had been present, he had not failed to notice, with his sensitivity to atmosphere, that his presence was deeply resented by Maria. Worse still, since Gilbert absent-mindedly talked agriculture, overlooked her, whereas at this time the hour was usually spent in loud chatter, arguments, and laughter. Micaiah could quite clearly hear these friendly exchanges, as his hut was very near that of Gilbert's. They pleased and surprised him, and he came to the conclusion that the aloof Maria had put a great deal of effort into the friendship. To no one else did she condescend to laugh and talk in such a gay, free manner. He understood her temperament, it being very much like his own, and he immediately interpreted the hostility as an inability to admit a stranger into a close relationship. It was this that made Micaiah take walks out into the sunset, but there was also a wide streak of unselfishness in Maria, and she in turn made an elaborate gesture of staying away. It only confused matters and exacerbated Micaiah because, for almost 3 nights after that, Gilbert kept breaking off in the middle of the conversation to say, "I wonder why Maria isn't coming round any more." And then he'd stare at Micaiah as though Micaiah had something to do with it. On the evening that Micaiah brought back the thorn bush seeds, everything came to a head. Micaiah found Gilbert and Pelatona, the permit man, seated around a log fire near Gilbert's hut. He joined them, and for a time the discussion was about salt licks, bone meal, and fodder, which were needed at the cattle ranch. Pelatona lived in a hut on the ranch, and for a year had managed both the ranch and cattle cooperative, being assisted by Gilbert only on cattle trucking days. After a while, Pelatona stood up and left for his home on the ranch. Noting that Gilbert's mood was silent, reserved, and aloof, Micaiah referred to the seeds, which he still held in his hand. Gilbert took them and immediately brightened. "You know," he said, "I noticed the very same thing. I looked it up and found out that the thorn bush is an acacia, a branch of the legumes, which includes peas and beans." And he had that expression on his face when he was about to launch out into the miracles and wonders of nature, but suddenly he broke off and slipped back into a mood of intense, reserved silence. He stared at Micaiah for a while and then said, "I hope you don't love Maria too." So that's what it all came to, Micaiah thought and smiled. And he just sat there in the shadowy light of the fire and maintained deliberate silence. It was all none of his business, and he was experienced enough to know that people who reach a deadlock in their emotional relationships often blame this on others. Gilbert simply interpreted this silence and stood up abruptly and walked into his hut. Micaiah did the same, with the only exception that Micaiah was at peace in his mind and hugely enjoying himself. He lit a lamp and picked up a book and then lay full length down on the bed to read. Gilbert paced about in his hut for a bit. He was disturbed and unaccountably angry with someone, but his mind refused to acknowledge who it was. After a time, he put on a thick blue jersey and walked down to the home of Denorego. He found the old man and Maria seated near an outdoor fire. They both looked up at his approach and then maintained an alarmed silence, as they could both see that something was wrong. It wasn't the same Gilbert, with that rushing expression of joy on his face, and he walked slowly with his arms folded across his chest. He deliberately ignored Maria and greeted the old man in a quiet voice. Maria stood up and said in a slightly trembling voice, "Would you like some tea, Gilbert?" He did not reply, but she rushed away into one of the huts, merely to go away from this nervous atmosphere, and then stood there, trembling from head to foot, unable to reach out for a cup and saucer. The old man looked at Gilbert solicitously. Whatever was wrong, he was not prepared to go into a panic until he had heard the worst. Denorego had great faith in his own reasoning ability. It was always there at the forefront, like a cool waterfall on his thoughts. Gilbert sat down and continued his intense staring into the fire. Eventually the old man said, "What's wrong, son?" Gilbert raised his head, and looked at the old man. "I'm going to marry your daughter," he said quietly. For once, Dinnerego was completely deprived of his speech. Not only that, his ready wit and sound moralizing on every event also deserted him. "Do you have any objections?" Gilbert persisted, since the old man just stared at him. "I am trying to put my thoughts together, son," Dinnerego said, at last. He had expected to hear a forecast about the drought, or that all the farm machinery had broken down, and just right now all that familiar side of Gilbert had been replaced by a man he hardly knew. He looked for a crutch and called out to his daughter. She appeared like a swift shadow and stood just outside the circle of light. "Do you hear what Gilbert says?" he said. "Gilbert says he is going to marry you. Are you agreeable?" "Yes, Papa," she said. The world righted itself a bit. "And when do you intend this marriage to take place, my son?" the old man asked kindly. "Tomorrow," Gilbert said. Dinnerego raised his hands in the air, as though saying that the whole business was a bit too much for him. "As you can see, I am very pleased, my son," he said, "only—" And he turned to Maria. "My child, you must go to Ma Milipede at once. She will know what to do about the marriage which is to take place tomorrow." Gilbert stood up and accompanied Maria for a short while along the dark footpath. From where he sat, the old man heard shouts of laughter and arguments, and he sat there smiling to himself, contemplating the mystery of youth. He had never seen another man survive so much frustration, difficulties, and trouble as Gilbert had. And here he was preparing to rush into more. And Gilbert, once Maria had left him, stood at the crossroads near the farm and looked up at the stars and laughed. If the old man really knew, Gilbert's life was simple and uncomplicated. Life to him meant love and work. It meant getting out of the rut and the habitual way of doing things. It was like all the rivers and sunsets and the fish in the rivers and the trees and the pathways and the sun and wind. But most of all, it was work, because lack of work meant death. And while he thought of all these things, Gilbert's mind was once more recalled to the workday world. Those trees he had forgotten to enlighten Micaiah on, the full meaning of the life of the thorn scrub. He turned and swung his way back to the farm. The lamp still burned in Micaiah's hut, and Gilbert knocked and, without waiting for a reply, pushed the door open and walked in. Micaiah balanced the book on his chest, glanced up briefly, and noticed the excitement that shone in his friend's eyes. The friend grabbed a chair, sat down, and took up the conversation at the point where it had been abruptly broken off. "The thorn bush is most definitely an acacia, Mac," he said. "Now the twining of the seed pod is a device for ejecting the seeds when they are ripe, so that they will be flung away from the parent plant. This also explains why the thorn bush is able to encroach so rapidly on cultivated land. It's the toughest little plant I know, but the goats are browsing it to death. Did you know that the goats are natural browsers?" "No," said Micaiah, smiling inwardly. "Goats prefer shrubs to grass, however lush and sweet," he said. "But they will eat grass when it is in seed. Much of northern Africa is desert today because the goats destroyed the thorn bush. I've nothing against the goats, you know. Without their meat and milk, we'd all starve in Holoma Mamidi. But we'll have to do something about controlling their eating habits one of these days." Gilbert sat for a moment in a deep thought, no doubt trying to invent new eating habits for the goats. But there was too much he had to keep a tab on tonight. His own emotional life kept intruding into his scientific speculations, and he suspected himself of having committed some grievous crime. It was unthinkable that he had precipitated himself into a marriage through the jealousy of Micaiah, and he was trying to work around this thought before springing the surprise. "You know," he said in a burst of generosity, "I'd meant to tell you this some age ago, Mac. You're Kipling's 1000th Man. Do you know the poem?" "No," Micaiah said again, and it was an effort for him to control his laughter. He felt he knew what was coming next. "Somehow I knew this the day you stepped into Holoma Mamidi," Gilbert said, "and it's just today that everything's clear to me." He quoted a few lines of the poem. "One man in 1,000, Solomon said, will stick more close than a brother, and it's worth while seeking him half your days if you find him before the other." But Micaiah had a few reservations about Mr. Kipling's sweeping statements. It was just chance that had brought him to Holoma Mamidi, and it was only chance and luck that operated in his destiny. I suppose you mean by that you're no longer mad at me, he observed dryly. You nearly bit my head off not so long ago. It's not you I was mad at, Mac, Gilbert said. It was Maria. You've no idea how she's made me run in circles for 3 years. Now it's all ended so easily. I can't believe it myself. I don't know why I never thought of going to Denerego in the first place. You know what he said? Do you hear, Maria? Gilbert says he's going to marry you. Do you agree? And all she said was, yes, Papa. Just that, after saying 1,000 different things to me. So I thought she'd change her mind and I'd say we'd get married tomorrow. By this time, Maria had already reached the home of Ma Milipede. She found her alone, reading in the Tatsuana version of the Bible. She was a little apprehensive as the door was pushed open and Maria stepped in, especially as a visit from Maria was rare. And then the child just stood there, a little breathless, flustered, and tongue-tied. Batho, what's the matter, my child? She asked anxiously. Papa sent me to tell you I am to marry Gilbert tomorrow. But why the haste? Said Ma Milipede, quite taken aback. Maria sat down. There's no haste, Mama, she said, in her earnest way. It's I who have delayed matters. Gilbert has asked me to marry him for 3 years. Does Papa agree? The old woman asked. Maria nodded, and Ma Milipede smiled inwardly, pleased that all her conjectures were at last confirmed. But curiosity overcame her, and she said, 3 years is a long time to delay a marriage, my child. Gilbert might have become impatient and run away to England. Then not only would you have lost him, but we too. Maria stared at the old woman with small, withdrawn eyes, and shook her head a little helplessly. How could Ma Milipede expect to understand all the complications of life? She placed one small, straight hand on the table, a way she had of showing that sentiment should always be separated from facts. Gilbert is a man with many strange ways, she said crisply. A person has to get used to these strange ways. For some time now, he has kept a lizard in the house, whom he treats as a person, and which is now accustomed to being spoken to like a person. Its name is Skin. Each night it is put down beside the lamp to have a meal of the insects that gather there. Also, I have often seen it asleep on the pillow, like a child, with its legs spread out. Gilbert does not live in this world, but in some world about which I know nothing. Ma Milipede nodded her head slowly, with an expression on her face which clearly said, "Oh, people, is that what foreign men are like?" "Are you sure you want to marry, my child?" she asked kindly. The young girl shrugged helplessly. "I don't know my own mind, Mamma," she said in despair. "I don't know what I want. You must help me." "But you help yourself with your understanding, my child," the old woman said. "As you know, we all live in a world that is full of danger. If a person cannot see this, he must be protected from the danger." Maria stared meditatively at the table. "I thought so too, Mamma," she said slowly. "I don't care about myself, but nothing must harm Gilbert." These words suddenly relieved Ma Milipede of the burden of sentiment that was clouding her practical mind. "There is so much to do," she said, "and so little time. We have to give a party. How often is there a wedding? Once in a blue moon. More likely it is a death or ailments that bring people together. 2 or 3 goats will have to be slaughtered and some chickens for high diet. I am out of rice. Has Papa any rice?" "We have plenty, Mamma," the young girl said. "And what about a pretty dress in which to get married?" Ma Milipede said. "Never mind. We shall go buy it tomorrow." She sat for a moment, ticking off the items in her mind. The goats would have to be slaughtered early in the morning and then hung up to dry. No doubt she would have to accompany her old friend to the wedding ceremony, and there was only one other woman in the village capable of managing the party arrangements while she was away, Paulina Cebeso. She stood up, searching for an old jacket, and accompanied by Maria, walked to the home of her friend Paulina. They passed the farm, and the lamp still burned in Micaiah's hut, and the 2 men still chatted like ancient blood brothers. They passed another home where the old man sat, staring pensively into the fire, contemplating the twists and turns of a long life, which might end any day now, he thought, since his last and youngest child was about to marry. But if Denerego thought about death near his softly glowing fire, Paulina Cebeso thought about life and how to have it more abundantly. and the bright, cackling flames of her fire danced upward into the black sky. She sprang to her feet as the old woman and the young woman approached. "I have a surprise," Ma Milipede said, and once she heard what it was, Paulina Cebeso turned around and too vigorously pushed a log into the fire. She did this to cover up her confusion, and the disturbed fire sent sparks in all directions. Paulina was unashamedly joyful that the stroke of luck had removed her deadliest competitor.